Welcome to the Savage Worlds GM podcast. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy. Tonight's episode, they did the mash, the monster mash. We're talking monsters in the kickoff episode of the first Halloween season. So this month's podcast and live stream is all about Halloween and Halloween themed topics. And we've said it before on the podcast. I'm going to make a special announcement. We've said it before on the podcast, so it's worth repeating. We've said in the past, bring me the head of Clint Black. And on October 25th, it shall be so. So for those of you who are subscribers on Patreon, Clint Black will be joining us in the green room on the 25th of October for the pre-podcast episode. And then joining us to talk about all things ghoulish, including some reveals and some discussion about Savage Worlds Adventure Edition and the Kickstarter. Tonight's topic, though, if you follow us on social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter at SWGM Podcast. Check out the website, Savage Worlds Game Master, savageworldsgm.com. Pardon me. If you are a fan of the live video, we're on YouTube. Like, subscribe, share. There is a playlist for every episode of this podcast live streamed there at youtube.com/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. And, of course, last but not least, if you like what we do or you want to get behind it, feel free to throw us a buck on Patreon, patreon.com/SWGM Podcast. And finally on the iTunes at Savage Worlds GM Podcast. If you're watching the live stream tonight, feel free to participate in the chat. We do bring that into the show. And here to discuss monsters in Savage Worlds, Chris, the Savage Mommy Fox.
Hello.
Dave, the Rules Maven Scott.
What's an atomic ninja?
Dustin, the Savage Zealot Smith.
Now with 20% less Russian bots.
Oh, always good for a hashtag, Dustin. Always good for a hashtag. So, for those of you who are not familiar, there is a entire Savage World supplement dedicated to horror. And it's aptly named the Horror Companion. If you've ever wanted to run Supernatural, the TV show in Savage Worlds, go grab a copy. It's got everything in there that you see in Supernatural: angels, demons, ghosts, wendigos, anything you can imagine you've seen on that show in 13 seasons, maybe with the exception of the Scooby-Doo episode, is in that book.
I mean, at least until someone puts out an official setting that looks something like it.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know if I could set that up any better, Chris.
Yeah. Sorry.
Insert plug here.
That's very true. Would that be? Hey, I told you before you started this thing, I'm out of it. Would that be something called Bureau 13?
Maybe. I mean, I hear that's where things like Supernatural and X-Files got the idea from.
Sure, that's what they stole the ideas from that Men in Black, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, yep. 2019, fall of 2019, I think Kickstarter.
And at least until then, you've got the Horror Companion.
That's right. Yes.
Generator in the green room. Build steam? No.
We're losing you, Jared.
I believe we need Dr. Frankenstein to resuscitate Savage Daddy.
I'm like, am I the only one hearing GLaDOS right now?
Everybody else smells toast, right?
Oh no, not the toast. So the last 2 minutes of what you were saying, we lost you.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Sort of. Not great, but sort of. Oh.
Well, if you lose the live broadcast, folks, it's because we had to get the host back on his own show.
Right.
I'll see if he's able to rejoin here in a moment.
So Halloween and stuff, and ghosts and horror companion and stuff.
Right.
I am not even going to pretend to try to run the show while he's gone. I will say I am freaking over the moon that we're going to have Clint on at the end of the month to talk about not only how to tie in the horror companion to the new stuff coming in Suede, but just to talk about Suede and swag and the whole 9 yards.
I'm loving the fact that we have our own adventure guild. I have an actual copy, and then I have the printout here so that like there's no Cheetos on my like real book. I don't know if anybody else does that, where you get the PDF and then you get the book, and like you save the book for when you want to impress people, but then you roll out the spiral bound. This is the workhorse.
See, I pull out the tablet that has the PDF on it, while the book just sits on the bookshelf looking nice.
Hey, look, he joined.
One.
I was going to say, Jared, that's the wrong one.
He joined back.
They both have sexy girls on them.
This one doesn't. This one is like TV friendly.
Sorry, people we're losing viewers so fast right now.
So let's talk classic monsters. Let's talk universal monsters. Frankenstein, the werewolf, the Wolfman, Dracula, the
Creature
Mummy,
from the Black Lagoon.
Yeah, Creature from the Black Lagoon, the Mummy.
Before we dive into that, do we want to take this comment from chat? Because I mean,
sure.
It's absolutely horror centric.
Sure.
Alec Fuzzy's asking about an idea he's had to create a courage value derived from spirit, similar like any of your other drive stats like toughness, etc. And calculated the same way as toughness, scary things have to overcome courage to do damage to your psyche. And then he goes on to say that, they used to have guts as a skill, but if you failed on this if your courage was exceeded, you could take, mental wounds. And I think what I would say to that is there's this really great sanity system right in the horror companion. And then Realms of Cthulhu has a great sanity system that does something very similar. But don't overlook the fact that Guts was not removed from Savage Worlds. It was just simply put in a designer's note that Guts should only be used in settings where it's appropriate, like a horror setting.
Right.
Asking a barbarian to spend points in Guts so that he doesn't have to run in fear from everything doesn't make a lot of over the top cinematic sense.
Right.
Guys, I'm not going to lie. If you play Deadlands and Deadlands still uses Guts, you are more likely to die from a fear check than a gunshot.
Oh, the fear index that they have in Deadlands, where you have those fear levels for each area you go into, that just automatically across the board makes everything else more difficult. That right there is going to kill you.
And grit. Let's not forget there's grit in that as well.
I mean, I would say grit's basically what you're looking for, Alex.
Yeah, it's kind of your courage system that you're talking about. Grit really kind of handles that pretty well.
Yeah.
And you could just, when they fail the roll for grit, and they end up failing a fear test on that guts check, you include all of that together, and just roll on the psychosis table from the horror companion.
Mm-hmm.
The psychosis table does a pretty good job of handling a pretty basic sanity system. So much so that the same sanity system basically appears in Weird Wars as well. It's basically the same sanity system from the horror companion. It's used in a lot of I wouldn't say the less popular Pinnacle settings, but definitely outside of Deadlands, it's used pretty frequently.
I think Deadlands is like the flagship, so it's kind of like our gold standard, what we go to and compare everything to. But I do feel that Weird Wars and Rippers do have good complements to that. Like with Rippers, it's pretty much a horror setting, even though it's sort of like horror slash I wouldn't say
cyberpunk.
I mean, like, here's the thing. Everybody says that Rippers is a steampunk setting, but it's not. It's really Victorian horror. Like, steampunk would have more to do with, like, technology.
Yeah, I would say what Rippers truly idolizes is the Penny Dreadfuls.
Yeah.
It really doesn't do anything steampunk whatsoever, other than the fact that weird science is a thing that exists in the setting. And even that's kind of downplayed on the steampunk side, because steampunk is so much an overriding aesthetic that when it's applied, it kind of takes over and you don't have room for much else.
True.
You know, and I think also one of the things to keep in mind is that Victorian horror is very different from the horror that's in steampunk, because most steampunk horror is very Cthulhu in nature, whereas Victorian horror is more the monster mash that we're talking about tonight. It's more your Frankenstein's monster, it's more your Dracula, that sort of thing. Did we lose Jared again?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, whew, sorry. I was just making sure too.
We're all a little gun shy at the loss of Savage Daddy.
Yeah, I have no idea what happened. It just dumped me out, lost connection.
That amazing Las Vegas internet.
It's probably the heat, in all honesty.
Not in Vegas right now. It's basically no. We're coming in. We're coming into our fall season, which means it's only 90 degrees outside, 758.
There you go.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so
that's where we were going with the Monster Mash.
Yeah, the Monster Mash. I think if we're going to talk about that, as far as just creatures and monsters in general, we're talking about classic cinema. You know, Universal Studios cinema movie monsters. Basically, every type of classic iconic monster you would see in like the Munsters. You have the vampire, you have a wolf boy or wolf man, you have the mummy, anything creature from the Black Lagoon, and you can do all of that. All of that really kind of exists in a lot of different settings. It's consolidated in the Horror Companion. If I were gonna try to do Frankenstein's monster, for example, or that concept, I would use the Patchwork Man from Deadlands Noir.
Yeah, there's Patchwork Man in the Horror Companion as well.
Yeah, but the one in Deadlands Noir just does a much more cleaner and better job than as far as that I've seen in actual gameplay. Patchwork Man just works great. Basically, you're talking about a flesh golem. At the end of the day, I mean, so just throw them together. A wolf man, half werewolf. Just take half of the werewolf stats. You can easily do a wolf man.
I would actually throw it out there. Why not go to the race creation and use the Rakashan?
You could. I think for me the wolf man. If he's your antagonist, I could absolutely see using the Rakasa as a starting point to then build out a wild card villain. Remembering the fact that I don't have to follow the rules when I build it. I can just, staple on the things that I think are appropriate. The problem I think I have with using the Rakasa in that way is that, to me, it doesn't capture some of the Wolfman properties. It doesn't have the lycanthropy aspect of it where you have the transformation. And it also typically doesn't have things like the silver weakness or the regeneration that goes with that. There's some aspects of it that are just absolutely missing. It's a great jumping off point, but I would still feel the need to kind of bolt some extra stuff on.
All right, tack a few extra things.
Now, one thing I would say is, depending on how you're trying to handle it, if you're going, with them as an antagonist or as a protagonist, either one, thinking something more along the lines of like your White Wolf World of Darkness settings, where the players get to play as those characters, I think superpowers to a certain extent, handles that. But honestly, when you get more away from the werewolf and into the vampire, that's a classic. Just give them the magic arcane background, and the power points are blood. And the only way they get it back is by feeding. And you've just taken and absolutely just kind of stood that thing up on its head and made a great version of the vampire.
I've actually been in a Friday night Drakkenheim game, and I've been playing a Damphir, and throughout the entire process, I've been building my character up until it matches the stats in Savage Worlds Deluxe. So I'm at heroic rank, and I finally got to the point where my character is pretty much legitimately identical to the vampire in the Savage Worlds Deluxe books. While I was going through, if you look at the shape change skill, and for those of you that have played White Wolf, Werewolf, the Apocalypse, like, you know, you have like different types of werewolf state. Like you have your Krynos, and you have like you have this one state where you're an actual wolf. You have one state where you're like half there, and then you have another one where you're a monster. So psychologically, if you look at the shape change power, you have the ability to turn into a wolf or a dire wolf. You have one where you have the ability to eventually reach tiger or lion, which would be a step up. And then you have another one where you get to be a bear. So if you're familiar with the Werewolf the Apocalypse game and the different states, if you give everybody as a starting power shape change and tell them that you're just going through these different shapes, you've got your werewolf game right there.
That's a fair cop.
Yeah, and just basically what you do is you take and you retrap the higher forms into just other forms of were-beast. It doesn't have to be, you know, they're transforming into a bear. That's, you know, the bear being the penultimate form is the true werewolf, where everything's manifest, while the lion might be the man-wolf thing. But yeah, you can absolutely, and some of that comes down to trappings, and we talked pretty extensively about that. And I know the Wild Die podcast actually recently had a conversation with Clint about trappings and how you can take and do some really interesting stuff with that, and how most of us should wait about 2 months and learn some more about trappings that's coming down the pipe. But I think, interestingly enough, where the arcane backgrounds really shine for monsters specifically is so many monstrous abilities can just be the bolt power retrapped, or, you know, the shapeshift power, or, you know, pick anything out of that book, whether it's the superpowers companion or it's the actual powers that exist, and you can retrap all of those as monstrous abilities.
Mm-hmm.
And then at that point, they don't even have to have an arcane background to use those once it's a monstrous ability.
Right. Well, if you take, for example, if you look at any vampire thing from Savage Worlds, because they're vampires, they all have the major habit blood.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the major habit retrapped, as they're dependent on blood.
Right. If you get into the actual like core book, you'll find that there are certain monstrous abilities that are they subtract 2 points, but then at the opposite end, like getting an edge or a seasoned level edge would also subtract 2 points. So why not some of those abilities just be like edges? You know what I mean? Like, if you can make the jump.
Well, yeah, if you're talking about using the creatures as player characters, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about putting them in as GM NPCs, just pick them up and use them.
Right.
I mean, the nice part is that Savage Worlds does just give you the ability as a GM to go, well, no, I don't have to build a certain number of points into this enemy. I can just go, it has regeneration, it has invulnerability, and it has claws automatically, and just run with it. And now I've got a creature that's weakness is silver, has invulnerability to most other damage where it's only getting shaken, and has these natural claws. And it just is gonna run roughshod over the player characters for a bit until they figure that out. I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to explain. I don't have to go and pick out specific hindrances or anything to give it. I can just very quickly kind of assemble that on the fly, so that, again, keeping in mind that suggestion we make on the podcast all the time, a D6 in everything and a D8 in what they're really good at. Now I can build the Wolf Man to just drop into the game without even ever cracking the bestiary, despite the fact the bestiary has some great things that could be turned into it and give it, a more fleshed out version.
Right.
So when we're talking monsters, Alec Muzzy brings up a very interesting point here, that the scariest thing in a horror tale is the normal human who's more of a monster than the bloodthirsty creatures are. And I think that, to me, while I absolutely agree can be the scary thing, that doesn't translate to gaming as easily. 9 times out of 10, that comes off as you've got an NPC who acts like a player character.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, if you think about it, where you see that really brought out, in my opinion, where I see that really brought out is in The Walking Dead. I'm a Walking Dead fan. Be it if you're reading the comic or you're watching the show, they talk about that sometimes it's the humans who are scarier than the zombies, because the humans have rational thought and can think about these horrible, awful things. I mean, I won't spoil anything for people, but I'll just say a name: Negan.
I'll say Mirror Image Rick.
I'll say hashtag Shane was ahead of the curve.
I think we're absolutely passing over a great example of it if we're talking specifically the show version versus more the comic. The show's version of the Governor, especially in the second iteration, where you see him that second time, really shows that off. But again,
right? Well, it's about people losing their humanity. What makes them human and kind and
I feel like, though, if we're going to compare the graphic novels to the show, the graphic novel version of the Governor was just a complete psycho. He was like your mustache twirling, put the virgin down on the railroad tracks and cackle. Whereas the Governor on the TV show, there are points where I'm watching that thinking I might actually rather be on his side than on Rick's side, because Rick is just like so wishy-washy during that season. And the Governor's like, look, we just have to survive. Like, that's just the nature of it. Save your bullets. Let's take what we need. He's just a realist. And that's kind of what makes him more frightening, is the fact that he's not just having fun. In his mind, he's justified why this is okay and necessary.
So to take this in a slightly different direction, rather than focusing on a TV show, I want to focus more on how do we achieve that in the game. And I think the only way you achieve the humans being the bigger monster is the monsters have to be paper tigers. They have to look, sound way worse than they really are. Almost to the point where the monsters fade in and just become the terrain and the trappings of the story, while the real meat of it, the challenges, come from other human beings. And a great example for me, at least, in keeping again that horror idea is the Wayland Company from the Aliens entire saga. You know, the alien is absolutely, demonstrably in each movie the prime mover. That is the character that everything is driven by. But when you look at the meta plot across the top of all the movies, what keeps that universe all together is this horrible motherfucking company that keeps having greed drive them to try to use those creatures in other ways and breed them and whatnot. And again, while this is a sign from popular fiction, what we see there is even there, in probably one of the greatest horror franchises that's been around, they fail to deliver on the humans are the worst villain. It's there. They just don't ever capture that on the screen because it's so subjective. It's such a difficult thing to do without giving you the inner monologue of the big bad. And I think that's why in a game, the only way you're going to get that is to kind of have the monsters be a letdown. Because your players aren't ever given that inner monologue of the bad guy. As a GM, you could be sitting there going, ha ha ha, they don't understand. But it doesn't, you're not accomplishing anything other than, you know, some self-congratulatory masturbation behind the GM screen.
I think you're really onto something there, Dave. I think playing off of that, has anybody ever read the book by Bram Stoker, Dracula?
Mm-hmm.
It's not so great.
Love story.
Yeah, well, story. The movie is the actual book it's based off of is like newspaper clippings and journal clippings, and it's kind of like, this is not so great. It's like found footage for the 1800s.
Yeah.
But Francis Ford Dracula's starring Winona Ryder and Keanu Reeves and Gary Oldman, and this is the point where like Gary Oldman became a G, where he became an ace, is they take it and instead of just being clips, it's romance. They take a romantic aspect to the Count and give him this sort of level of philosophy. And that's what makes it more frightening, is because now getting into the depth of vampires' hunger and desire and torment, and how does he actually manifest as a monster?
And he doesn't even need to sparkle.
There
are no vampires in Twilight, only sparkle fairies.
So, and I mean, Alec Muzzy brings up the idea that zombies are overdone.
Boo to you, Alec Muzzy. Boo, I say.
And he specifically singles out the brain-eating zombies are overdone. He wants voodoo zombies.
Never seen a zombie on Walking Dead eat a brain. They eat lots of other parts, though.
The brain-eating zombie is entirely a popular culture thing. It doesn't actually exist in 90% of the fiction.
Okay.
The Tar Man eats brains.
Yeah,
hold on a second.
Parody movies that did it.
The only reason there's any attachment at all to zombies and brains is due to Return of the Living Dead, a pop culture 80s B movie where the zombies look at each other and go, brains.
Yeah,
that's the
Tar
only reason. Yeah, the Tar Man. That's the only reason.
And what's his name? Jonathan Coulter, who sang the zombie song. I just
Yeah.
I just
all you want to do is eat your brains.
Yeah, it's bad.
That's a great
80s,
song.
It's bad 80s horror parody comedy. But
if you really,
well, I understand. I understand what Alec's saying. He's saying I think what he's saying is the Romero slow moving, eat human flesh zombies are the ones he's saying over. And I understand where he's coming from. I just, as a Walking Dead fan, I have to give him shit.
I think. Good.
To a certain extent, though, it's kind of missing the point of what that was supposed to have been about. And I think that's the reason we see things like Walking Dead as is kind of struggling to keep another season coming out that people are engaged with. We're seeing the whole video game industry went ham on zombies, and it's all been this gratuitous violence of killing zombies, and it's it's all been Zombieland, for lack of a better way of looking at it. It's all been this high adventure. Everyone is very competent and capable. But if you actually go back and watch the actual original Romero zombie stuff, that's not the case. The people are almost as bumbling and inept as the brain dead zombies are. But it's about, what did those people do when there's no electricity, there's no running water, there's no police to call when someone takes your stuff, or when you're threatened. That's the interesting stuff, and I think that's why even products like War of the Dead haven't performed as well as we all want them to. We're all big fans of the zombie genre across the board in gaming, but it never does great because really all we're doing is we're telling these high-action stories with this insert random extra character I can gun down. And after a while, that gets really boring.
So back to Universal. We keep coming off the track. Let's talk Universal, the classic monsters. So you could just do the werewolf from the Horror Companion or the werewolf from Savage Worlds bestiary. They're about the same, pretty much identical. What about like a Creature from the Black Lagoon? It's just aquatic.
I was just going to look and see if there was anything like that in here.
There's the Ictherian.
Yep.
Yep. You have a couple of
fishy.
Okay, guys, I'm gonna make this confession. Like, I am digging the Aquaman comic. All right, and I know you're like, that is not connected to monsters. Yeah, it is, because like what they do is anytime they're stuck. Oh, Chris, the Ictherian's on page 94. They will bring up horrible monsters from the deep. All right, there's this creature in Aquaman, and it's like a whole race of mutated Atlanteans called the Trench. They call them the Trench. And they're piranha men. And they're bioluminescent. And like they've got like this, like, you can see their brain. And they're just terrifying to look at. But they're so hideous. They're also kind of beautiful. So for that, I'm kind of saying you could either go with the Ictherian, or if you wanted to go serial killer and then go add some of the features from like race Atlantean.
Well, see, to me, I think if we're talking more like the Creature from the Black Lagoon, that style, I would go with something more like the seaweed themed from the Horror Companion. Because, I mean, it's quite literally like, that's the Savage Worlds equivalent to the Bog Beast.
Mm-hmm.
It's aquatic, yeah, kinda, but really, you're not fighting it in water. It just happened to have come from water. It's more this idea, it's the attack of this force of nature, quite literally wrapped in nature.
What if we go with the troll and just give it the aquatic ability?
Works as well.
Yeah.
You could also do, you want to do King Kong, just take a basic bestiary image for a gorilla and make it gargantuan. Done.
And if you
scale it up the size, and it's gargantuan.
For those of you who can't find a gorilla, try a bear.
Yep.
One thing to keep in mind, if you look at the very beginning of the, I want to say it's the Game Masters section in the, for using the bestiary, around page 140-ish, 139, there's an entire section on how you can use fear and trappings with all the stuff from basically any Savage World stat block, whether it's the gorilla or it's the crocodile, and then turn that into this horrible monster for your game because of the fact that it's not about the monster having stacks of monstrous abilities, but it's about the way you deliver that creature. The way you as a GM shape the scene around it can make it far more horrific, and you don't have to make it more difficult to defeat. You know, a lot of these creatures in Savage Worlds are genuinely difficult to defeat as soon as you just simply make them a wild card. You don't have to do anything else. Just make them a wild card. Give them their own bennies, and give them the ability to soak wounds because of that. And all of a sudden, your player characters are possibly in a corner facing off against what is an unstoppable train of destruction.
Well, and if you look at the Mummy entry, for example, in hold on. If you look at the Mummy entry, for example, go ahead and take over the conversation, guys. I got to handle something real quick.
The Mummy from the Horror Companion.
Which version? Because there's a couple different versions out there. So I'll say this: the fun thing with the Mummy is it all depends on the era you're playing the game in. Like the modern Mummy versus the fantasy Mummy, a little different because your fantasy Mummy's probably got magical powers, while your modern Mummy has more supernatural. You know, he's not casting spells as much as maybe he's controlling sandstorms or, you know, using the puppet power, that sort of thing.
Or you just give him you just take the basic zombie stats and just wrap him in bandages and give him a weakness to fire.
Yeah.
Yep.
Instead of headshot.
You know that the Mummy was a stand-in for the vampire. Like, that's originally what the Mummy was meant for. Like, that's why it goes around, like, consuming the flesh once you wake it up. I mean, look at the parallels between them as characters.
Well, wasn't it actually not so much a stand-in as much as they just took vampire stories and retrapped it with mummification to kind of capitalize on the huge boom in Victorian England around all the artifacts that were coming out of Egypt at the time?
Yep.
You know, I thought it was entirely a creation of the Penny Dreadfuls, where they took stories they were already telling and just wrapped the antagonist in cloth to call it a mummy.
You are absolutely right. That is what they did, because they didn't have, like, the Mummy was not a horror-based story. It was just like the afterlife for ancient Egyptians. So in order to create a monster, they took vampires. And here's the thing. Like, there's different versions of vampires. There's different versions of mummies. They're all basically undead. Like, think about it. A ghoul is basically a zombie, but it doesn't eat the living. It eats the dead. A revenant comes back from the dead to seek revenge, but it's not stupid. But it's not a vampire or a zombie. Strigoi, which, if you watch The Strain, that's not a Strigoi. That's just literally a ghoul. Were warlocks that were also vampires.
Right. You have the classic fantasy with the Lich.
Mm-hmm.
The same idea. A necromancer brings himself back from the dead. Yeah.
Yep.
So Mabel brings up an interesting idea here. The rethinking of the curse on Tutankhamun's tomb. I think the interesting thing with the Mummy has nothing to do with the stat block.
No.
I think it's entirely the curse and the way you pitch that story that makes the Mummy way more interesting than they ever can be based on just being a stat block of statistics. And again, this comes back to that idea that, you know, make them a paper tiger. You know, make the real threat kind of, you know, secondary. You know, your mummy story is less about the actual physical mummy. And, you know, they don't have to have a D4 in everything with invulnerability, weakness, fire. You've already made a nearly unstoppable creature right there. And then you do the entire story, your entire game is about dealing with the curse of having set this thing loose.
I'm going to go ahead and throw something out there as a story hook or story idea for you. All right. You release the mummy, you take on the curse, but there's a group of you. Somebody has got the bright idea. If they throw everybody else in front of the mummy, then they can get out of the curse. So while the mummy is chasing you guys, someone in like the whole like story is a traitor.
Oh yeah, the betrayer in the mummy story is pretty common, where the mummy has to get all of its organs back, and so it's going to kill the different people that unleashed it, harvesting the organs from them. And there's one person who is leading the mummy through the group in personal self-interest style. I don't want to die, but I just don't have to. I just have to be faster than the rest of you fucks and let the mummy eat you. And then I spend my time kneecapping you.
Right. So let's talk about one of the other classic Universal monsters, the Blob. You just make it take something that's gargantuan or add gargantuan to the swarm, and you've got the Blob.
Give it an engulf.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. No.
Yeah.
Swarm
because
with the acid trapping.
Right, and it's gonna just kind of blob over you and do automatic damage. It doesn't need to do it to hit.
Right.
Basically, it like a swarm, it moves over you and it does that auto acid damage.
Mm-hmm. That and if it's a wild card, that thing would be horrible to deal with.
Oh,
that would be
a card swarm. Regardless of whether or not we're doing the blob and it's acid damage or it's just a plague of locusts, if it's a wild card swarm, that is horrific to deal with.
Mm-hmm. A wild card swarm. Yeah, gosh, I'm terrified to think of this.
And again, the cool thing with the blob and being a swarm that pops into my mind that fits it so well is like that as you're doing damage to it, it's going to split.
Oh,
and then you're going to have to deal with 2 blobs.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's going to split. And you're going to deal with 4 blobs.
And that's not requiring you do anything special with the rules. That's just right in the rules for a swarm.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And here's the thing: people always like, "Oh, the Blob, please. That's not a horror movie." Really, put your PC party of players in a city that's being overrun and taken over by the Blob.
Yeah.
And all they have to do is escape. That's all they have to do. But the Blob is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Like every corner they come around, it's coming over. It's engulfing all the cars in the street and coming at them.
It's coming up out of the sewers. Like you just step in it and suddenly it's got you.
Mm-hmm.
Throw on the entangle power as well. Let it reach out.
Especially with the new entangled and bound statuses that are coming, where your character can get entangled, and then on another success they become bound. And you can rapidly find yourself in a really bad situation with the way that new status is going to work. And
in a world of hurt.
That is scary to a special degree.
And then there's always the classic ghost that I think a lot of people just don't really give its due from Savage Worlds. I mean, number one, you can't harm it.
Yeah. Ghost, poltergeist, anything that's disembodied. And ETU, to a certain extent, does these really well. But more importantly, if you take a look at the other stuff from 12 to Midnight, like they've got entire adventures around this idea of you're in a home that has a single poltergeist in it. And all of a sudden you're being pelted with coffee cans out of the cupboards and knives come flying, and there's nothing you can do other than try to figure out why it's there. And so now this is kind of the quintessential take your monster and make it a hazard. because you've got this beastie that the players can't directly go after with combat. There is no combat solution to a ghost.
Yep. Now, if you want to have some more fun with it, if you take a look at the horror companions, some of the special abilities that the creatures have are possession. And in Savage Worlds, it's a simple opposed spirit roll to possess somebody. And at that point, it's basically the puppet power for a player character who gets possessed. And as a GM, I can't tell you the kind of fun and havoc you can wreak with a simple possession. Of they go into a home, they're fighting this ghost, and it just takes over. And it doesn't have to be the strongest member of the party, whatever. It just possesses somebody.
You have the ghost possess the weakest member of the party and then become slightly off from the way that character normally acts, and then have them slight the strongest member of the party, and you start that party infighting dynamic. You have to have the right players who want that experience, but that is absolutely... And then all of a sudden, the ghost lets go. And now the player has control of their own character and doesn't know why everyone's suddenly pissed at them.
Right, and that's the thing you should do, too, as a GM. If you're going to do a possession, they're not in control of them the whole time, puppet power. They take control at the worst possible moment.
I mean, if you think about it, a Herod is just a zombie that regenerates with a ghost as its enemy.
I mean, to a certain extent, I'm not going to say you're wrong. I've always thought of the Herod as more a revenant with his ghost.
Yeah, with a ghost chained to him. He's a like the ghost is his enemy. But yeah, it's like
he's a friend along for the ride.
Sometimes,
like for example, one of the things you can do too, going back to the ghost of possession thing, put them in an actual. I think this would be a great adventure. They're locked. They walk into this haunted house basically, and they're locked in for the night. Supernaturally, none of the doors or windows will open. They can't get out, and then put hazards in front of them. They walk up the stairs, and the stairs give way. And when they look down, it's just a hallucinatory pit from hell. And then what you do is you have the person who's possessed reach out and grab that person and hold on to him. And then the ghost takes over and starts counting to 3 and letting go. That's the kind of thing you do. And at no point in time is the player character in any real danger, except from heart attack from fear.
Yeah.
Everything is about fear, not real physical harm.
Stop and think about how much worse that gets with the newly released test mechanic, where now the ghost is just using its smarts to fool you into an illusion of thinking that something horrible is happening, and just sets the scene for all of these horrific little moments where, well, this just disappears. You don't know where it went. It's just gone.
Right. And whoever is possessed should also suffer the fear as well. So the ghost that possessed them should have them turn around and see all their friends as decaying corpses. Out of nowhere. They just turn around to have a conversation. Go, oh, by the way, you're talking to Bob. And when you look at Bob, he's a decaying fleshy corpse that's talking to you. Give me a fear check at a -2.
So we've talked pretty extensively about recapturing the classic tropes. What about taking the trope and standing it on its head? This stuff like whether we're talking zombies and you make them running zombies, or you give them a stink power because they're rotting flesh, and now it's not about worrying about whether or not the zombies can eat your brains. It's worrying about escaping the toxic cloud that moves with that horde. Or taking the blob, and instead of making it, the big gigantic blob, make it a series of small little blobs that each one's a little blobling, and every time it eats something, whether it's a rat or a character's shoe or item, it doubles. And now you've got 2 bloblings or 4 bloblings. The split doesn't occur because you've done a bunch of damage to it, but instead, every time the players fail to stop something from happening, it splits. or take the vampires and let them walk around in the day. All of a sudden, you take away what the player characters think they are armed with to stop the big bad. And when you take that away, like have your werewolves are immune to everything except for copper instead of silver. You can take those tropes and just stand them on their heads very quickly and easily. And then you've opened up a door that the players have to use things like the investigation skill to figure out what the hell they're supposed to do against a vampire instead of a vampire.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, take the zombie, right? The typical zombie. No, the headshot doesn't kill it. No, I just blew its head off. Yeah, half of its head is gone, but it's still coming at you. Like what? Like no, this one you have to pull. It's a GM. This one you have to pull the heart out.
Yeah,
you have to destroy the brain. You have to destroy the heart.
So I remember I ran a game, and it was a cyberpunk game, but it was with vampires. It was Vampicalypse. I took out the suzerain and I just used like basics, and we had like feral zombies, or we didn't have feral zombies. We had like feral vampires, and everybody just treated them like zombies because, you know, they were like slow moving, hungry biters. And then one of them taunted one of the feral zombies, and it taunted him back. And all the players were like, wait a minute, these things aren't mindless. And I'm like, no, you're not fighting zombies. You're fighting vampires.
Yeah, there's so much you can do with stuff like that that subverts what the players are expecting. And again, I'm not saying it's bad to play to the trope. You know, if you're playing a classic Victorian era Penny Dreadful where they're up against Dracula, oh no, make him Dracula and make all his followers the standards, you know, minor vampires and zombie, you know, puppet things. But then in a different game, instead, your vampires are actually afraid to feed on the player characters because the player characters are all immune, and feeding on them turns the vampire back into a human.
Yeah.
You know, that immune blood reverses the effects of vampirism. You don't know why, you don't know how, but it's just this thing that happens. So now all of a sudden, the vampires aren't fighting to grab you and eat you. The vampires are trying to capture you so they can throw you in a vampire jail to keep you away so that you don't cure vampirism and stop them from taking over the earth.
Well, there's also, I'm going to kind of throw this out here, and then we'll one of the things we want to talk about in the coming series is establishing tone, setting up a campaign. I want to touch on that just very briefly because we've been talking about what Dave's talking about, like turned it on its head. There's a little known werewolf movie from the 80s called The Howling. And it does.
The Howling's a good flick.
Yeah, it is.
It does a spectacular job at it. Basically draws the main character in as a reporter. And there's this commune. They basically so the spoilers on a movie from 1983, but you know, all the way, don't listen, skip ahead if you want spoilers. But there's this idea that there's this pack of werewolves that want to merge with society and be peaceful. Their leader, the pack leader, is trying to get everybody to get along. Let's not draw attention. Let's kind of blend in. And they have this psychological wellness retreat in the woods in like the Pacific Northwest. And there's a small little community with a barn, and all the members of the community live in that small little community. And it's very tranquil and everything else. Lo and behold, one of the members in that werewolf pack goes into New York City and just goes full werewolf and starts killing people. And they think it's a serial killer. So the reporter is approached for an interview with this guy who claims to be responsible. And as they're investigating it, they find out, oh, he was part of this commune. She goes there, and the whole thing, there's all this foreshadowing all the way along. And then the movie ends with the entire colony wolfing the fuck out. And they're suddenly surrounded by all these werewolves that they thought were these kind, gentle people of this community.
Mm-hmm.
Can totally do something like that as a side. Take your characters on. Oh no, this guy runs an animal shelter, and he's amazing with dogs. He's a dog whisperer, whatever. And you can just sort of boom. Next thing you know, they're surrounded by like 8 werewolves.
Well, and I think there's a lot of interesting directions to take stuff like that again require, that session 0 conversation to set the tone. What if you allow player characters to be infected? So, whether that's infected with a zombie virus from a zombie bite or, infected with lycanthropy because they came in close contact with a werewolf. Now that player's character maybe transforms at the full moon. And every once in a while, that character is expected to suddenly become an antagonist for a session. And, the player has to role play the guilt and the weight of having done that between each time that happens. And then also has to, through the power of their fellow players, find a way that their character doesn't go and do horrible things at the full moon, or again going back to the zombie question, where all of a sudden you've got the character who's been bit and is going to become a member of the living dead. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's right there in the horror companion, infectious bite. They become a member of the living dead as soon as they fail enough vigor rolls that they've gained the last level of fatigue. They die, and it's 1d10 minutes, and they stand the fuck back up. So now your character is sick and hiding the wound, hidden under their jacket or whatnot, and they're not telling their friends that they are the living bomb among the party.
Yeah, and you could always do a thing too. I mean, it's a classic movie plot. Oh, our best friend was bitten by a werewolf. We have to figure out who the head werewolf is, or blah, blah, blah. You take the Lost Boys plot, for example.
Yeah.
You could totally run that in Savage Worlds. Just absolutely use the horror companion. Absolutely. But if you don't have access to it, you could just as easily pick the vampires, the elder ancient vampire, and then the young initiate vampire for the bestiary, and populate that world and run that adventure. And give it the twist.
This is something that they don't talk about. If you feel like there needs to be more mooks, like you said, you could go with zombie, and it could be blood, or you could go with orc and major hindrance blood.
Oh, there's any infinite number of combinations and trappings with Savage.
You could just pull out the bandit stats.
Yeah.
And give them, the hindrance to, have it blood. In that regard. And that's where, again, the stat block isn't the important aspect here.
Right.
It's more how you pitch it. The interesting thing that the horror companion does in this regard is it says, here's some extra monstrous abilities. Here's some of the classic monsters you're expecting, like the bog fiend being the seaweed fiend, or the vampire. There's vampire stats. Mummy, there's mummy stats. Frankenstein, there's the different stats. Those different things exist already in the horror companion, but I'm looking forward to the next couple of weeks where we talk about some of the other stuff that's in the horror companion that really helps you take this to the next level, like ritual magic, or the sanity system, or and I mean, bear with me here, but gritty damage.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to talk about something that how nasty is it when the vampire has claws? How much nastier is that when the vampire has claws, and every time they hit you, you're rolling against the injury chart?
Yeah, there's ways to really grit it up and edge it up, and it also depends. And the horror companion kind of goes on this. We'll talk about this too in upcoming episodes. but it talks very quickly about, subtlety versus gore. Choose your style of play. What style of horror is it? If you wanted to play something with a classic Universal monster movies, right? Players could find themselves locked in a wax museum at night, and all the wax figures come to life. They're no real threat, but they're constantly being pursued, Scooby-Doo like, through the entire wax museum. Like Frankenstein never really does anything except go and chase you. It doesn't have to be this horrendous meat grinder where you're telling the player characters, "Oh, you're all gonna die." It doesn't have to be that, and it can still be fun. It can still be a horror setting. It doesn't have to be dripping gore and it's a meat grinder and TPK.
Jared, are you trying to tell the listeners that, or are you trying to convince yourself of that?
Oh, I'm telling the listeners that. I don't follow my own advice. So anyway, shape, or form.
Because I've played in your horror games. No one survives.
Yeah, welcome to the meatpacking plant. Step on up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Welcome to the abattoir. Okay. Any classic or any kind of monster thing we want to add on here at the end? Anything in chat we want to talk about real quick? As we're coming up on time.
Ruben brought up the idea of radioactive.
Yeah.
The radioactive or biohazard. He uses undead, but I don't even think you have to go to the level of undead. I think it's just you take any creature and make it radioactive, and it is suddenly horrific.
Right.
And then the reverse is, make it a biohazard, make it toxic in some manner.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing that jumps to my mind on that one, and I can't remember if it was radioactive, but an old movie, maybe late 70s, Food of the Gods. Have you guys ever seen Food of the Gods with all the animals, the rats, the rabbits, all the animals, the ants? They were irradiated or something and just became huge. It's one of those Towering Inferno type movies with all those old 50s and 60s people trying to still make money, Joan Collins and those kinds of people.
Roger Corman.
Yeah, but it was called Food of the Gods, and you could do a Food of the Gods type thing and have it be just as scary, because, I mean, when you have a, gargantuan rat coming at you or a gargantuan swarm of rats, yeah, that's not going to be fun.
Yeah, you could always also do, and as kitschy as it is, you could always do the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman and just take a regular standard NPC and then, no, it's 60 feet tall. It's got the gargantuan stat. Only heavy weapons damage it.
I do know one I wanted to bring up that I had mentioned in the green room, and that is something that Ed and the guys did from 12 to midnight in ETU, and that is they actually put in a demon generator where it's like you draw through a deck of cards to just kind of randomly generate the big bad demon for the night. And that is such a classic thing to do for an October thing, is just do Monster Hunt of the Week for the entire month of October, and every monster is a random deck of cards where you just flip up 5 or 6 cards and that builds the monster for you. So even you as the GM aren't intentionally building something, you're just taking and throwing this amalgamation of stuff together that comes up to be either a demon or a blob or, a werewolf or a mummy or whatever.
I'll tell you what I think. The greatest episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer that would make a great little one-shot for a Halloween Savage Worlds adventure, the greatest plot available is the one where the guy comes into town and he sets up a Halloween costume shop. And everybody becomes the thing that they're dressed as when the sun goes down. Boom. You're that thing. You have those skills. And then it's really fun for the players too to go, you're all going to a Halloween party. You've all been invited to a Halloween party. There's a new shop in town. They've got everything. And they're offering deep discounts. What do you go to the store for? And what costume are you wearing? And then as a GM, you took a bunny? All right. At midnight or when the sun goes down, that PC takes on bunny traits.
Oh, I mean, one of our greatest actual plays we've done for the channel was when we did ETU, and all the player characters had to describe what their character was wearing to the costume contest that night. You know, we were all going to a costume party on Halloween, and everyone had to describe what their college student character wore to the costume party. And I mean, it just that's a solid hour of role play that you can add to any session just by adding in a little thing like that. Even if you don't do the twist of you become it at the end of the night, just letting them have that moment that you always see in a good horror where life is normal. Set the scene by letting them role play something where life is normal for that character before it all goes, horrifically wrong.
I would say the most frightening episode of Buffy, if you really wanted to scare your players to death, is make them do the singing episode.
Or go dive deep in Angel and everybody's a puppet.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, not just for that one episode, throughout the whole series, they're all puppets.
I had it and it's gone. God damn. Oh, let's talk about the penultimate. We need to talk about the penultimate horror antagonist monster. The Jason Voorhees Friday 13th unstoppable killer hatchet wielding hackmaster. Very
Michael
simple.
Myers.
Yeah. Invulnerable. Just invulnerable. You can do enough damage that what it would do normally to any other wild card, wound it, incapacitate it, kill it. You can chop its head off. You can chop it in little pieces. The next morning, it's getting back up. Wholly reconfigured and coming after you.
Yeah.
You just give it the invulnerable power with no weakness.
I think that, like, how I would do that is the only person that can kill it is the last living member of the party.
Yeah, we'll talk. I want to talk about the next week. I kind of want to touch on party configurations and the final girl, those kind of classic horror movie trope characters, and they're almost like a 5-man band of the horror genre. Mm-hmm. You always got the jock, the smart girl, the final girl, right. Kind of concepts. We could talk about that next week. So if we don't have anything else in the green room, we don't have anything else in the chat, I think we'll wrap it up. So until next time, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Dustin, Dave, and Chris saying keep rolling and stay savage.